Muy buenos días. Tengo el honor de declarar abierta esta sesión protocolar del Consejo Permanente, convocado el día de hoy para recibir al honorable primer ministro de San Vicente y las Granadinas, el excelentísimo doctor Ralph Goncalves, quien se dirigirá a este consejo para tratar el tema reparaciones por la esclavitud y el genocidio de las poblaciones nativas. Distinguidos delegadas, señoras y señores, por favor, ponerse de pie para dar la bienvenida a su excelencia, Ralph Goncalves, primer ministro de San Vicente y las Granadinas. Su excelencia, doctor Ralph Goncalves. Su excelencia, doctor Ralph Goncalves, primer ministro de San Vicente y las Granadinas, distinguidos miembros de la delegación del primer ministro, secretario general, señor Luis Almagro, secretario general adjunto, embajador Néstor Méndez, distinguidos representantes permanentes, distinguidos representantes alternos, señoras y señores representantes de los observadores permanentes, invitados, amigos, damas y caballeros. Permítanme extender en nombre del Consejo Permanente y en el mío propio una muy cálida bienvenida a la sede de nuestra organización, a su excelencia el doctor Ralph Goncalves. Me complace también ofrecer una cordial bienvenida a los miembros de la delegación que lo acompañan. Sean ustedes muy bienvenidos. El primer ministro Goncalves, conocido por todos nosotros, gran luchador, líder emblemático del Caribe Oriental, de América Latina y el Caribe, es el líder del Partido de Unidad Laborista. Fue electo primer ministro en el 2001, habiendo renovado su cargo en el 2005 y 2010. Estudió Economía y Políticas Públicas en la Universidad de las Indias Occidentales. Tiene un título de licenciatura en Economía y una maestría en Gobierno por la Universidad de las Indias Occidentales. Posee también un doctorado en Gobierno y un título de abogado por la Universidad de Manchester y del Gray's Inn en Londres, Inglaterra, respectivamente. Durante sus estudios de doctorado, pasó un año en la Universidad Makerere, en Uganda, como investigador asociado. El primer ministro Goncalves es un hombre visionario y progresista que ha alzado su voz ante el mundo en búsqueda de saldar la deuda histórica, consecuencia de la esclavitud y genocidio a la que fue sometida por parte de la opresión colonial el pueblo africano y sus descendientes y los pueblos indígenas de nuestra América. De él escuchamos en varias oportunidades la historia de los Harigunas, ese sacrificio de esa población indígena original de esa zona que terminó en las costas centroamericanas de algunos de nuestros países. Nosotros mismos, desde mi país natal, Venezuela, vimos una gran influencia con todas esas poblaciones indígenas que fueron desde el Orinoco, desde Venezuela, desde las costas venezolanas a todo el Caribe Oriental. Esa esclavitud nos condenó a vivir por muchos años en la pobreza, vulnerables, excluidos y humillados, víctimas de atroces violaciones de derechos humanos. Recientemente, en una visita que hiciera el presidente de Venezuela, Maduro, Nicolás Maduro, a San Cristóbal y Nieves, a través del Acuerdo Petrocaribe, se pudo dar un apoyo a los trabajadores de la industria del azúcar, que durante años fueron liquidados sin ningún tipo de remuneración económica y se habían quedado completamente sin nada. Gente que había ya muerto, hubo que hacer una contribución a su familia, personas con enfermedades crónicas, personas de 80 años que, bueno, cuando acabó la industria azucarera, se quedaron en la calle, por decir un ejemplo, para decirles los efectos que ha tenido eso y que tiene eso sobre la vida diaria de estos países. Sin embargo, la libertad ulterior de estos esclavos no conllevó a la igualdad. Las reminiscencias de aquel pasado colonialista se presentan hoy bajo nuevas formas de opresión y violación de los derechos humanos. Nos enfrentamos a otros desafíos, la trata de personas, el racismo y otras formas de discriminación. A este respecto, el primer ministro Goncalves ha propuesto que la reivindicación del legado de los pueblos indígenas y de los negros esclavos sea agregado a los objetivos del desarrollo sostenible de las Naciones Unidas. Ha dicho: es necesario defender los derechos de los descendientes de las personas que viven en nuestro territorio y que hoy exigen una recompensa, una reparación por los daños causados. Constituye un punto de honor para la República Bolivariana de Venezuela, ejerciendo hoy la presidencia del Consejo Permanente, traer a nuestro amigo, a nuestro camarada Ralph Goncalves, entrañable amigo, entre otras cosas, de nuestro recordado presidente Chávez, y acompañarlo en esta lucha que es de todos los pueblos de América Latina. Se trata de un justo reclamo que exige solidaridad, comprensión con esta agenda impulsada por nuestros hermanos y hermanas caribeños. El reclamo de las reparaciones por tratarse de graves violaciones a los derechos humanos es un asunto que nos concierne e involucra a todos, y no solo a los compañeros y hermanos del Caribe. América Latina y el Caribe poseen una agenda común. Contamos con mecanismos de integración que han permitido estrechar aún más los vínculos excelentes entre nuestros países. Estamos trabajando en la búsqueda del bienestar genuino de nuestros pueblos, de la independencia definitiva de nuestras naciones y de la consolidación de nuestra patria grande de América Latina y el Caribe. Me permito ahora ofrecer la palabra al secretario general de la Organización de Estados Americanos, señor Luis Almagro, que se dirigirá a la sala. Tiene usted la palabra, señor secretario.
Señor presidente, somos conscientes, y debemos serlo, que la historia oficial de las Américas ha sido escrita a espaldas de los sectores minoritarios, en especial de los afrodescendientes y pueblos originales. Desde la trata esclavista, los colonizadores quitaron el alma a estas personas para tratarlos como propiedad, minimizaron su cultura y trataron de eliminar todos vestigios de las mismas para ejercer su dominación. El racismo y la discriminación racial han sido parte de los últimos 5 siglos en nuestro continente, en especial desde el inicio de la denominada trata negrera. Este penoso comercio tiene su punto de partida en Portugal, cuando el rey Juan I delega la tarea de búsqueda de nuevas rutas hacia las Indias a su hijo Enrique el Navegante. Así que los portugueses, para llegar a las Indias, bordean las costas africanas. El llamado descubrimiento de América fue un precedente importante para que se intensificara la trata negrera. El contagio de enfermedades y la explotación a la que eran sometidos los indígenas causaron reducción importante en la población local, otorgándose las primeras licencias para la introducción de las primeras decenas de esclavizados. Estas licencias fueron llamadas licencias de merced o de servicios, lo que permitía la introducción de esclavizados durante su comercialización. Las grandes potencias de la época se dieron cuenta que la trata negrera era más lucrativa de lo que se pensaba e incentivaron la exportación de esclavizados a sus colonias, ya que se pagaban impuestos por dichos conceptos. Mientras más esclavizados eran llevados a las colonias, se generaban mayores ingresos a las arcas reales. Pero no solo las potencias se dieron cuenta de lo lucrativo de la trata, sino también los contrabandistas de esclavizados. Esta trata, legal e ilegal, tuvo como consecuencia, en primer lugar, la interrupción del proceso y evolución de los imperios africanos, imperios que tenían una compleja organización. En segundo lugar, África subsahariana fue saqueada y despoblada de sus habitantes en edad productiva. En tercer lugar, los esclavizados sufrieron una vejación y humillación, siendo utilizados como mercancías y dejándolos en la base de la pirámide social. No podemos saber exactamente cuántas personas esclavizadas vinieron a las Américas. Se manejan cifras que establecen los documentos oficiales, empero no existen documentos del inicio de la trata como tal. Menos aún se sabe el número de esclavizados que fueron vendidos a raíz del contrabando. Se presume que las cifras van entre 20 a 60 millones de africanos, pero para la historiadora mexicana Luz María Martínez la cifra alcanza a 100 millones de africanos. Es un crimen contra la humanidad. Las condiciones en que eran trasladados, el hacinamiento, la falta de comida y agua, falta de higiene, las enfermedades, originaba que en los mejores casos solo el 60% llegaba con vida a las Américas. Esto sin contar las torturas, violaciones y humillaciones soportadas por su condición. Los sobrevivientes de esta travesía de la muerte y sus descendientes aportaron significativamente a la construcción de los estados americanos. Utilizaron su inteligencia, su fuerza y su cultura en diversos campos de expertise, como la arquitectura, la ingeniería, la medicina, la minería, la agricultura, la ganadería, entre otras. Entrando en lo jurídico, en el año 2000 se celebró la Conferencia Regional de las Américas, la cual fue la conferencia preparatoria de la tercera Conferencia Mundial contra el Racismo, la Discriminación Racial, la Xenofobia y sus formas conexas de intolerancias, también llamada Conferencia de Santiago. En dicha conferencia se aprobó la Declaración y Plan de Acción de Santiago. Dicha declaración y plan de acción son históricos para la población afrodescendiente por muchos motivos. Los Estados americanos, en instrumento de derecho internacional, reconocen que el legado de la esclavitud ha contribuido a la permanencia del racismo, a la discriminación racial, a la xenofobia y a las formas de intolerancia contra los afrodescendientes a través de la región. Los Estados americanos reconocieron que la esclavitud y otras formas de servidumbre de las personas de origen africano y sus descendientes y los pueblos indígenas de las Américas, así como el tráfico de esclavos, fueron moralmente reprochables y en algunos casos constituyeron crímenes conforme al derecho internacional. Eso definitivamente sigue vigente hoy día. Los Estados americanos se exhortaron a tomar medidas para remediar las desigualdades que aún persisten debido al oprobioso legado de la esclavitud y a facilitar la participación de los afrodescendientes en todos los aspectos de la vida económica, social y cultural de la sociedad, en el progreso y en el desarrollo económico de sus países, y a promover un mejor conocimiento y respeto por su herencia y cultura. Se establece una definición jurídica de afrodescendencia. Se reconocen derechos, se reconoce la importancia de la participación de la sociedad civil. Es un instrumento jurídico muy fuerte. Nos falta todavía muchísima acción al respecto. Y nosotros instamos a los estados de las Américas a ponerse las pilas, ponerse baterías en cuanto a este diseño de la afrodescendencia. Nos falta muchísimo y tenemos muchas cosas por concretar todavía. Quisiera también hacer un reconocimiento aquí, algo que para mí siempre queda olvidado en los trasfondos de la Revolución Francesa y de la Revolución Americana. Pero la primera revolución en el mundo que reconoció la igualdad de todos los hombres fue la Revolución Haitiana. Y fue un vestigio, fue un centro de libertad en un continente en el cual estaba rodeado por prácticas esclavistas. Definitivamente, la reivindicación empieza por allí, por ese centro de libertad creado en el medio del continente. Muchísimas gracias.
Señoras y señores, gracias, señor secretario. Como dije anteriormente, constituye para mí un verdadero honor presidir esta sesión protocolar para darle bienvenida nuevamente a su excelencia Ralph Goncalves y escuchar sus opiniones, siempre inspiradoras, llenas de profundo sentido histórico, caribeño y latinoamericano, sobre este tema de las reparaciones. Su excelencia, tiene usted la palabra.
Mr. Chairman, my dear friend and brother, Bernardo, Distinguished Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Your Excellencies and other invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am very happy to be here this morning. As some of you probably are aware, I'm about to commence an election campaign for my 4th consecutive term in office, and this has taken me a little bit away from the hustings, but this is an unavoidable duty to speak on this subject. So I want to thank you very much for having me. I want to speak on 4 broad areas so that you can follow me better. First, I want to give a broad overview as to why we're making this claim for reparations for Native genocide and African slavery. Then I want to sketch the philosophical and legal bases for reparations, and then to say a little about my own country, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, insofar as the claim, the quest for reparations is being made. And I'd like to talk a little bit too about the special case of Haiti. And I hope in the process I can appeal to you to help us to carry the struggle a little further. That's essentially what I'm about today. This compelling subject of reparations for Native genocide and African slavery from those European nations, mainly Britain, France, and Holland, this compelling subject has brought us together. And these 3 nations perpetrated historic wrongs against humanity in the Caribbean during a period in excess of 200 years between the 17th and 19th centuries. The quest for reparations is not conceived as a strategic confrontation against these European nations, although it is for us in the Caribbean a defining issue in the 21st century for justice, reconciliation, and the righting of historic wrongs. The struggle for reparations in the Caribbean involves centrally a mature conversation with those European nations for an appropriate recompense to correct the legacies of underdevelopment occasioned by Native genocide and African slavery. Note the formulation. For an appropriate recompense to correct the legacies of underdevelopment occasioned by Native genocide and African slavery. And since CARICOM is making the claim, we have the former British territories would make the claim in relation to Britain, and Haiti in relation to France, and Suriname in relation to Holland. If this mature conversation does not yield a satisfactory result for the Caribbean nations, we intend to take the matter to the International Court of Justice for adjudication within the framework of international law. Crisscrossing this mature engagement is the necessary and desirable diplomatic, political, and educational endeavor in our region, our hemisphere, and globally. We are at an opportune moment for discourses on and possible resolution of the claim for reparations as part of the post-2015 development dialogues and in the context of the United Nations Declaration of the Decade of People of African Descent. It is an appropriate and convenient juncture for the engagement on reparations between the Caribbean and Europe to be facilitated as an special carve-out in the post-2015 development dialogues touching and concerning the 17 Sustainable Development Goals adopted recently in September 2015 at the United Nations General Assembly. The case for reparations is unanswerably strong. It rests on moral and legal grounds. It is not concerned with the search for the direct descendants of those who suffered from native genocide and African slavery to be paid specific sums of money. It does not involve as a starting point a quantification claim in today's currency of the assessed value of every person subjected to native genocide or African slavery and the assessment of the land stolen from the native population by Europeans. It is not about the representation in today's value of the 20 million pounds sterling paid by the British government to the slave owners in the 1834 to 1838 period in the Caribbean. Incidentally, that sum of 20 million pounds in today's value, multiplying by the objective factor of 839 amongst the 16.78 billion pounds sterling. If you think that I've taken 839, the factor, out of the thin air, I invite you to look at the studies done by Professor Draper and his group at the University College of London on this specific issue, the Slavery and Reparations Project. To be sure, these quantification benchmarks, which I've just indicated, I've just spoken about, are indicative of the extent of the recompense and more required as reparations to Caribbean nations. However, our quest for reparations is about repairing the legacies of underdevelopment which exist today and which are undeniably traced to native genocide and African slavery. I want that point to be understood with clarity. I repeat, it is not about searching for descendants of those individuals who are subjected to native genocide or African slavery and to pay them a specific sum of money. That is not what this is about. Because to do that, you're embarking on a near impossible task. It is not about having as a starting point for quantification the 20 million pounds which the slave owners were paid in the 1834-1838 period when the slaves were freed, and putting that in today's value, which would be 16.89 million pounds sterling. Those kinds of quantification are indicative of the numbers and more which would be required as recompense. What we are addressing is the real lived experiences today of the legacies of underdevelopment which can be traced directly to native genocide and African slavery. To this end, the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, has adopted a 10-point reparations agenda which covers the repairing of the awful material and psychological legacies of underdevelopment in a number of areas, including the economy, poverty reduction, education, health, housing, infrastructure, culture and memorials, the demand for a European apology for native genocide and African slavery, and the special matter of repatriation voluntarily to Africa of Rastafarians. This agenda is envisaged as obtaining appropriate recompense, separate and distinct from the usual discretionary international aid granted bilaterally or multilaterally by European nations to the Caribbean. We want this to be adjudicated, agreed upon, or adjudicated if cannot be agreed upon, not as something discretionary, but something which is legally binding. And I will make the case for you in an outline. In seeking thus far to avoid an informed conversation on reparations, the British government recites the mantra that it is interested in engaging the Caribbean with the future, not the past. But this assertion is grounded in a profound fallacy. The consequences or legacies of native genocide and African slavery are not matters of the past. They are a lived reality in today's Caribbean. Repairing them is very much a matter for the present and for the future. To amend the poetic summation of one of the iconic national poets of my country, the deceased Daniel Williams, we are all time. Only the future is ours to desecrate. The present is the past. Indeed, the past has been shaped by the state-sponsored public policies of native genocide and African slavery, perpetrated by the respective European nations, of which Britain was the most infamous in its extraction of wealth for itself and the impoverishment and more of native peoples and African slaves in the Caribbean. The righting of historic wrongs is at the heart of the case for reparations for native genocide, lands stolen, and slavery. I say stolen, I put that in quotation marks because as a lawyer I have been taught that you can't steal lands. You can only steal something which is capable of being moved. But obviously, that's a narrow concept, so I put stolen in quotation marks in relation to the land, and I will come to that briefly in relation to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The claim is grounded in justice and fairness. And it is to be recognized, too, that the Caribbean is not coming to the issue of reparations with a blank page. There have been several claims for reparatory justice which have been satisfied before international tribunals or settled within the ambit of international law, grounded in fairness and justice. Why not? If it is so in the case of some other peoples, why not the countries where we have had native genocide and African slavery? Indeed, in 2001, at the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, held in Durban, South Africa, the then president of Cuba, Fidel Castro, addressed this matter thus, and I'm quoting Fidel here, quote, "Cuba speaks of reparations and supports the idea as an unavoidable moral duty to the victims of racism, based on a major precedent, that is, the indemnification being paid to the descendants of the Hebrew people, who in the very heart of Europe suffered the brutal and loathsome racist Holocaust. However, it is not the intent to undertake an impossible search for the direct descendants of the specific countries of the victims of actions which occurred throughout centuries. The irrefutable truth is that tens of millions of Africans were captured, sold like a commodity, and sent beyond the Atlantic to work in slavery, while 70 million indigenous people in the hemisphere perished as a result of European conquest and colonization," unquote. That was Fidel in August 2001 in Durban. An international legal scholar, Mari Matsuda, and you can find an interesting article by him entitled Look into the Bottom, Critical Legal Studies and Reparations in the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Review, Volume 20, number 323, 1987. And Matsuda correctly advises that a human injustice that attracts a claim of reparations must meet three basic criteria. One, the injustice must be well documented. The historical data setting out the specifics of the injustice should withstand scientific scrutiny and be verifiable to the satisfaction of a court or tribunal. Two, the victims must be identifiable as a distinct group. And three, the current members of the group must continue to suffer harm. The political leaders in CARICOM are all satisfied that the historical data on native genocide and African slavery and the contemporary condition of the descendants of those who suffered from these crimes against humanity are such as to make a proper fit for these three criteria. The awful legacies of native genocide are real. The terrible many-sided scars of underdevelopment are before our very eyes, sourced to native genocide and African slavery. Of course, it is my duty to acknowledge that a bundle of legal arguments have been proffered by those who oppose reparations for native genocide and African slavery. I have to tell you what those who don't want to embrace the claim, what they're saying, so you can see whether their arguments have merit. And if you consider that their arguments have merit, you say, well, Ralph, you're talking a lot of rubbish, and we're not with you. So let's look at their arguments. These revolve around the doctrine of relevant law and practice at the time when the events giving rise to the claim of reparations occurred. That is to say, that at the time when they set about killing the natives and enslaving Africans, it wasn't a crime. That's one argument. The second is the idea of historical remoteness of these crimes against humanity. It's so remote. Why are you dealing with that? It's so long gone. And the absence of the actual perpetrators of these crimes and the victims. But you see, those are arguments made if you're making a normal civil claim for compensation. There's a statute of limitations on crimes, on wrongs. There's not a statute of limitation, of course, in relation to crimes against humanity. But they tried to take themselves out of that boat by saying, well, they were not crimes against humanity because the law at the time didn't consider them so to be. And in any case, how are you going to find the descendants of the perpetrators and also of the victims? Are they responsible? Or the perpetrators, the descendants of the perpetrators, or the children, the offspring, the descendants of the victim, that they should get direct money? That's if you're making, as I say, normal claim. But in international law, there are adequate answers. And remember that the approach which we are using, that CARICOM is using, is to speak about today the continuing legacies of underdevelopment which can be sourced to native genocide and African slavery. So you avoid the issues of remoteness. You avoid the legal issue that it is. How can you find the perpetrators? You look what is happening today. And I will come to the issue as to where there is international law supporting that particular approach. In any event, of course, this is not merely a legal issue, it is a moral issue. It's a profoundly moral one to be pursued through coordinated political and diplomatic efforts. And my appearance here today at the OAS is part and parcel of this political and diplomatic exercise. This informed gathering is surely aware that the CARICOM member states and the relevant European nations have signed and ratified relevant international conventions such as the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which mandates that countries responsible for historical racism, genocide, and slavery have an obligation to assist in repairing the contemporary legacies of underdevelopment. There's an international convention on that question. And that's one of the conventions under which we are approaching this matter. Indeed, the very 2001 Durban Conference, to which I referred earlier, on racism, discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, acknowledges that slavery and the transatlantic slave trade were, quote, appalling tragedies in the history of humanity, not only because of their abhorrent barbarism, but also in terms of their magnitude, organized nature, and especially their negation of the essence of the victims, unquote. Those are not my words. Those are the conclusions of an international gathering under the auspices of the United Nations. CARICOM member states and the relevant European nations, Britain, France, and Holland, are also state parties to the International Criminal Court of Justice, which adjudicates on these matters within the framework of international law. Last year, CARICOM established a CARICOM Reparations Commission, CRC, to pursue the claim of reparations. This is not a matter which is on the fringes of public policy. This is a matter where sovereign governments, which constitute CARICOM, have made a determination. And we have not gone off, as would be said on the streets, half-cocked. We have addressed this matter carefully, and we have reflected upon it, and we have come to serious conclusions as to how we should proceed. So we have set up this CARICOM Reparations Commission. Its chairman is the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, the distinguished Professor Hilary Beckles. And its vice chairman is the esteemed Senator Jomo Thomas, an activist lawyer from my country. This is a commission with serious people. It's about serious business. Professor Hilary Beckles has authored a recently published book of huge importance entitled Britain's Black Debt: Reparations for Caribbean Slavery and Native Genocide. I commend it to you as essential reading on the subject. I believe it's available on Amazon. Each member state of CARICOM has set up its own National Reparations Commission to interface with the regional coordinating body. A significant amount of preparatory work has been done by the CARICOM Reparations Commission under the guidance of a Prime Ministerial Subcommittee of CARICOM, chaired by the Right Honorable Frundell Stewart, Prime Minister of Barbados. And I also sit on that body. The CARICOM Reparations Commission, in concert with legal and other experts, is advising CARICOM on the best mode of proceeding with the claim for reparatory justice. In the meantime, CARICOM is engaged in essential diplomatic work and political sensitization globally. Importantly, the Community of States of Latin America and the Caribbean, CELAC, and numerous countries worldwide, including several in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, have already endorsed CARICOM's push for reparations. Non-governmental organizations globally have been in support. It's not something which anybody can push under the carpet, you know. You can't push this under the carpet. This is a defining issue for the Caribbean in the 21st century. And anybody coming to us have to talk to us about this. You may disagree with us. It's a serious conversation which we must have. I don't have to go in front of number 10 Downing Street with a placard in my hand. I don't have to rant and rave on the subject because I have morality and law on our side. And after all, why should I go with a placard outside number 10 Downing Street? I am no less a prime minister than Prime Minister Cameron, and therefore we must engage in a mature conversation on this subject. Earlier this week, on Monday, November the 2nd, Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro, who was on a state visit to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, proposed that the Bolivarian Alliance for Our America, the ALBA, hold a special high-level summit early in 2016 in support of CARICOM's reparation claim. I accept this wise and timely proposal. In Britain, in 2007, the influential and moral voice of the then Archbishop of Canterbury, the spiritual head of the Church of England and the Anglican community worldwide, Dr. Rowan Williams, was heard loud and clear on the side of justice for the descendants of slaves in the Caribbean. On March 27, 2007, in a sermon at Westminster Abbey in London, to mark the bicentennial of the abolition of the slave trade, Archbishop Williams said as follows, quote, "We," he was talking to English people, British people, he said, "We who are the heirs," H-E-I-R-S, "we who are the heirs of the slave-owning and slave-trading nations of the past have to face the fact that our historic prosperity was built in large part on this atrocity. Those who are the heirs of the communities ravaged by the slave trade know very well that much of their present suffering and struggling is the result of centuries of abuse. Slavery is not a regional problem in the human world. It is hideously present in our nations and cultures. But today, it is for us to face our history. The Atlantic trade was our contribution to this universal sinfulness, unquote. Archbishop Williams went on to proclaim that the Spirit of Jesus spoke to men and women more than 200 years ago to facilitate the end of the trade in enslaved Africans. The slave trade was ended in 1807, and the slavery itself between 1834 and 1838. Archbishop Williams then posed a vital question and made a consequential plea. Quote, "Is that spirit contemporary and alive in us today?" That is to say, the Spirit of Jesus. Is it contemporary and alive in us today? If so, we shall have the courage to face the legacies of slavery. We shall have the courage to turn to each nation and ask how together we are to make each other more free and more human, unquote. I accordingly adopt that very question and plea for you, the assembled ambassadors and representatives of the member states of the OAS. I urge you to answer it positively and render all practical support to CARICOM's quest for reparatory justice. I want to turn very briefly to native genocide and African slavery in my country, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. One of the first acts of the British colonizers in 1764, a lot of people who don't like to talk about these things, you know. Remember, I've made the point already, which you would appreciate surely, that this is not something in the distant past, you know. No. This is something where there are contemporary legacies of native genocide and African slavery. One of the first acts of the British colonizers in 1764, 1 year after the conquest and acquisition of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, was to declare that all land in our country belonged to the British Crown. By the way, nobody invited the British to come to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In a general carve-up of Caribbean possessions, they and the French said, these islands for France, these for Britain. That's how, in the general carve-up, the British took suzerainty over St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In 1763, at the Treaty of Paris, all very neat and legal, except nobody asked us anything. So in 1764, they said all the lands belong to the British Crown. At one stroke, they deprived the Kalinago people, the so-called Yellow Caribs, and the Garifuna, the so-called Black Caribs, who are descendants of the original Caribs and Africans. Deprived them of their land, which was held in common by them. The British overrule of my country was unbroken from 1763 until internal self-government in 1969 and formal independence in 1979. And save and except for a brief period, 1779 to 1783, when the French temporarily dislodged British occupation and settlement. From 1764 until 1795, the Kalinago Garifuna nation fought the British colonizers. After all, if you come to take my land, I will fight you for it. It's a normal human response. Don't you agree with me? You leave where you're from in Europe and come to my country to take my land. I must fight you for it. The land issue was central to the popular native resistance to British colonization. Bit by bit, chunk by chunk, the British took the lands of the Kalinago or the Garifuna on one pretext from another. The British finally defeated the Kalinago, Garifuna people in 1795 and in subsequent skirmishes. By 1800, the Kalinago Garifuna people were practically quarantined on an assigned paltry parcel of 238 acres of land in an inaccessible area of the northeast of St. Vincent. Thus, between 1763 and 1800, a period of a mere 37 years, the Kalinago Garifuna people lost to the British the remainder of their 85,120 acres of land on St. Vincent and the 10,880 acres in the Grenadine Islands. The British government sold much of the lands to the British elite or allotted lands as grants to preferred persons who had fought in the Caribbean for them or alongside them in the American War of Independence. For instance, there's a Colonel Brown who fought with the British against the Americans. They gave him the small matter of 6,000 acres. Well, why didn't they give him part of London or Oxford or Nottingham? Why give them St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So they either sold the land, the money was put in the British Treasury, or they granted it for political purposes. In a study which I've done on this land question, and the book in which I've done it is called The Case for Caribbean Reparatory Justice. It's available on Amazon. I have found that the British diverted into the private hands of British people some 32,694 acres of land, amounting to US $469 million in today's value. The remainder of the lands, amounting to approximately 64,000 acres, remained in the ownership of the British Crown. Then I turn now to the people. Land is one thing, the people. In 1763, when the British assumed suzerainty of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there were an estimated 9,000 Kalinago and Garifuna in our country. During and after the anti-colonial struggles by the indigenous peoples, approximately 2,500 of them were killed out by the British. A further 2,445 of them, mainly Garifuna, died of diseases and starvation on the barren offshore island of Baliso, to which they were forcibly sent between July 9, 1796 and February 1797. Another 2,248 were deported to Roatan Island in the Bay of Honduras. Thus, approximately 5,000 of the indigenous people were subjected to wanton genocide, and a further 2,248 deported to the Bay of Honduras. In this way, roughly 80% of the Kalinago Garifuna nation was decimated. And just think of this. The decimation would have been largely the productive people, strong young men and women, leaving little children and elderly people. I don't have to read and spell for you to tell you what is the effect of that on the underdevelopment. And you take away my land and put me in 238 acres of the worst land, inaccessible. You're beginning to get the picture I'm talking about the contemporary legacies. 80% of the Kalinago Garifuna nation was decimated. This is a horrendous statistic for which the British nation is culpable and responsible. The legacy of this genocide and forcible deportation is still being adversely experienced today. This terrible legacy has to be repaired. Not surprisingly, the northeast base of St. Vincent, known as Kalinago Garifuna country or Carib country, is still today the most pronounced area of material poverty in our nation. Hardship, pain, and anguish abound, despite commendable efforts by nationalist governments since 1951 to put right the legacies of native genocide. Monumental repairing is still left to be done. It is important to note that the descendants of the Garifuna who were deported in the late 18th century to the Bay of Honduras now reside mainly in Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and the USA. These 5 countries which are members of the Organization of American States. They have populations which came from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. These descendants of the Garifuna who were deported maintain a spiritual and existential bond with our country, which is still called You Remain, the Aboriginal name of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. African slavery as an organized socioeconomic system in my country arose after the British introduced plantation slavery as a systemic mode of socioeconomic organization in 1764. Between 1764 and 1807, when the slave trade formally ended, 55,562 African slaves were brought to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a number less than the 62,176 who had been forcibly abducted and put on the vessels in West Africa. By the time slavery had been finally abolished in 1838, the African slave population had been reduced to 22,997, indicating a large attrition rate due to a higher mortality rate of an aging, predominantly male population, coupled with an insufficiency of reproduction. The slave owners were paid for their slaves in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the rest of the Caribbean at an average of 26 pounds sterling per slave, or 21,814 pounds sterling in today's value. The actual sum paid in totality to the slave owners at slavery's end for all the slaves in St. Vincent and the Grenadines was 592,509 pounds sterling, or 497.1 million pounds in today's value, using a factor of 338 on the 1838 values. The historical data in respect of much of the other Caribbean countries are available in Hilary Beckles' book, Britain's Black Debt, to which I earlier referred. What is being said here of Britain in relation to the former British colonial possessions in the Caribbean can with more or less equal force be said of France as regards Haiti and of Holland in respect of Suriname. I turn briefly to the special case of reparations for Haiti. And I'm very glad to see my Haitian brother is here. In a book entitled An Unbroken Agony, Haiti from Revolution to the Kidnapping of a President, published in 2007, its author, the well-known American fighter for justice internationally, Randall Robinson, provides a gripping account of France's successful demand for reparations from Haiti. Notice, France's demand for reparations from Haiti for the loss of property, including the slaves, at the time of the Haitian Revolution. This payment of reparations from Haiti to France has contributed immensely to Haiti's underdevelopment. It is a tale of imperialism's unjust power and might over a poor, relatively defenseless nation. I want to give you the basic facts. Some of you must be saying, how did I miss that part in History 101? Yes. Haiti was required to pay reparations to France after the Haitian Revolution because the slaves had the temerity to free themselves, and the French said, no, you are my property. Of course, this thing makes your blood boil, but as mature people, we can't allow our blood to boil. We have to use our brains. And we have to address the issue within the framework of international law. We are mature leaders. Basic facts on Haiti. In 1825, 22 years after the death of the Haitian revolutionary leader, Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian army was a weakened and divided force. France threatened to re-enslave Haitians and imposed an ordinance requiring from Haiti a payment of 150 million francs and a 50% tariff reduction for all French ships docking in Haiti. To meet the first payment of 30 million francs under the ordinance, the government of Haiti had to borrow the full amount from a private French bank. We have the name of the bank. In 1838, after extensive negotiations, under a French-Haitian Treaty of Friendship, very interesting name, the original obligation of 150 million francs was reduced to 90 million francs. Haiti was required to make annual payments of at least 2 million francs per year for over 30 years. These payments were in addition to repayment on an additional 30 million francs from the first private bank. Haiti was thus coerced into borrowing commercially to pay a huge unjust obligation to France. As late as 1915, or 111 years after the successful slave revolution in Haiti, some 80% of the Haiti government's budget was being paid out in debt service to French and American banks on loans that had been contracted for Haiti to pay reparations to France. In 1922, 7 years into a 19-year military occupation by the United States of Haiti, that resulted in the death of 15,000 Haitians, the USA imposed a $16 million loan to the Haitian government to pay off its so-called debt to France. Of course, the Americans are very helpful. You owe this money to France, we'll give you a loan, get them off your back, but you have to pay us. The American loan was finally paid off in 1947. Haiti was left virtually bankrupt and impoverished. It has never really recovered from this unjust imperial imposition. So when people see Haiti, and they make all kinds of the narrative, oh, don't pay attention to those people, they believe in too much voodoo. You know, this, that, and the other. You know, but you have to look at the real history, not the rubbish we are being fed. And once we know it and we understand the contemporary legacy, if we are serious people, we have to take it seriously and do something about it. In the early years of the 21st century, President Jean-Bertrand Aristide of Haiti pushed the issue of righting this historic wrong. He made an unequivocal demand for reparations from France for slavery and genocide. Aristide was involuntarily removed from office. Notice I'm very careful with my words. I'm not saying there was a coup. I'm not saying anything of the sort. I'm just saying he left involuntarily. Did his call for reparations lead to his fall from office? Many thoughtful people think so, although the matter perhaps had other subsidiary complications. A CARICOM push for reparations includes Haiti as a very special case. Haiti is very much on board in our multilateral quest. Now, we have to have a solidarity on this question. We're doing the preparation to have the mature conversation. If the mature conversation doesn't yield results, we go to international law, the court. We come to you, we go to the United Nations. Look, there's a solidarity. My brother, whom I apologize for not recognizing him, I don't think he will send his armada to invade St. Vincent. My brother, the Assistant Secretary General, Ambassador Nestor Mendez, my dear friend. In 2002, his country was afflicted by a hurricane. Dandriga, which is a settlement where you have a large number of Garifuna people, descendants from those who were deported. We took the opportunity in my country, every school child gave $1 towards the people of Belize, specifically to address to Dandriga. Our government matched it. I delivered the check myself in Belmopan. And in addition, our country, though a poor country, We lent our brothers 10 million US dollars to help to repair the damage. You hear me? Solidarity is about not giving the leftovers, but giving from the little that we have. That's the essence of solidarity. It is the essence of loving your neighbor, as expressed in the book of Luke with the Good Samaritan. You have to be our neighbor's keeper. And I appeal to you. I appeal to all right-thinking persons in the Caribbean, Britain, France, Holland, Africa, the Americas, and the entire world to embrace reparations for slavery and native genocide as just. The case for reparations, I reiterate, is unanswerably strong. Those who have been opposed or indifferent to reparations, I urge you to rethink the matter. Search your soul and identify with the claim for appropriate recompense in repairing the terrible legacies of native genocide and African slavery in our Caribbean. The rethinking and soul-searching of the 18th century British slave trading sea captain John Newton, who came to a full understanding of the unspeakable crime of slavery on his way to his calling as a preacher of the gospel, is apt in the circumstances. You might have heard President Obama singing a song in the deep south of these United States to commemorate an activity, an important human rights, civil rights struggle. Remember, he sang Amazing Grace in the church. Well, John Newton was a slave captain who came to realize that slavery was wrong, and on his way to become a preacher of the gospel. In 1772, he penned this hymn, Amazing Grace, which has moved generations of hardened skeptics, cynics, and wayward souls, particularly in his first verse. And you know it well. And I want you, every day you get up, this must be in your head. And we use our minds to right this historic wrong, provide solidarity. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Thank you very much.
Señor Primer Ministro de San Vicente y las Granadinas, la Presidencia del Consejo Permanente de la OEA, en nombre de los Estados miembros, agradece a Su Excelencia por habernos honrado con su presencia y haber compartido su opinión sobre el tema de las reparaciones. Creo que su último mensaje de que debemos buscar en nuestras almas la moralidad y la importancia de hacer de este tema de las reparaciones un tema de todos nosotros. Creo que usted lo ha explicado con justicia, con sentido histórico, con estética, con belleza y con un amplio sentido de la solidaridad. Y creo que nos tocará a nosotros ver los mecanismos a través de los cuales podemos apoyar y permitir que se profundice y se concretice esta iniciativa de ustedes. Muchas gracias, querido amigo y primer ministro. Señoras y señores representantes, esta sesión ha concluido. Se agradece a las delegaciones permanecer en sus asientos mientras el excelentísimo primer ministro de San Vicente y las Granadillas, su excelencia Goncalves, pasa a saludar a las delegaciones.